Ian, thank you very much. Thank you for joining Energy Live News. I would like to start with the role of the cement industry in the global decarbonization efforts. They say that the cement industry is one of the world's biggest carbon polluters. Cement accounts for roughly 7% of all global emissions, which is the role of the cement industry nowadays.
Yeah, so thanks, Dimitris. It's a pleasure to talk to you today. The cement industry, as you say, is responsible for about 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a problem that the industry has recognized for many years. About 20 years ago, the industry set up something called the Cement Sustainability Initiative under the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And this was 10 of the largest international cement companies who came together to set out a sustainability agenda, which involved not only CO2, also other pollutants such as NOx and SO2 and dust, as well as safety, and set targets for each of the members, set their own targets for how they would reduce those emissions that went beyond the statutory requirements. So this was a voluntary program, as I say, started about 20 years ago. And I think as a result, partly of that and other efforts, the carbon emission today for a ton of cement has been reduced by a little over 20% by comparison with the levels when CSI was started. But that still leaves it at this very substantial level of 7%. Now, cement is used in concrete. And concrete, of course, is one of the most widely used materials. In fact, the second most widely used after water. And it's really essential to urbanization. You can't build urban infrastructure without concrete. So while there are some opportunities to substitute concrete in some applications, the challenge is how are we going to get to a net zero concrete? And the emissions from concrete are primarily from cement. The other constituents of concrete, of course, are sand and aggregates. And so this is the challenge we face. Now, historically, we've looked at how can we reduce the emissions from cement? And the three levers that we've pulled have been energy efficiency, the use of alternative fuels, so moving away from coal to primarily to refuse-derived fuels, and then reducing the proportion of clinker in the cement. So the CO2 emissions come primarily from the production of clinker. So clinker is the product that comes out of the kiln, and to make cement, the clinker is ground and mixed with other materials, always gypsum and sometimes other materials like slag and limestone, pozzolan, or fly ash. So those are the three levers that have traditionally been pulled. And if we look at where we are today and where we could go with current technology, then there's probably an opportunity to reduce by, let's say about another third. If all of the plants were new, you could go further than that, but realistically, that's not going to happen. So with the existing asset base, we can probably reduce by another quarter or a third, with the biggest contribution coming from that last lever of reducing the proportion of clinker in cement. So that still leaves us with a problem that at least is, let's say, 70% of the 65 or 70% of the emissions that we have today. And that's where we've been looking for new technologies that haven't been used in the industry to try to address that. And the one that has been used most extensively or trialed most extensively is carbon capture and storage. But carbon capture and storage is a pretty expensive solution. And when we take into account that 90% of cement is used in the developing world, then it's not clear that that's really going to be sufficiently cost effective to be embraced globally as a solution. But there are alternatives and very interesting alternatives to capture the CO2 and to utilize it in concrete. But that I suppose is a quick sketch of where we are.
Ian, do you feel that carbon capture is the most promising area of technological development regarding the concrete and the cement?
Well, let's talk about the concrete first and then come back to carbon capture. Traditionally, concrete is made by taking cement, aggregates, sand, and adding water sometimes also various chemical additives to create the concrete. So the cement itself, as I said earlier, is where the vast majority of the carbon footprint is. So the emphasis to date has been trying to reduce the carbon footprint of the cement. And there are some new or newish technologies that offer the promise of further reduction in the clinker content of the cement. I suppose we should also say that in some places, concrete manufacturers themselves will add non-clinker cementitious materials in the concrete plant. In other places, they like to buy a cement that is ready blended, but the net effect is much the same, whether you're blending it at the concrete plant or the cement plant. So some of the technologies that are being looked at the moment, probably the most interesting one is something called LC3, which stands for limestone calcined clay cement. This is using a technology that has been around for a while, but has been somewhat optimized more recently, so that you've got a blend of clinker, so 50% clinker, 35% calcined clay, and 15% limestone, which gives a cement or a concrete with very similar properties to concrete made with OPC, which is typically 90-odd% clinker. So that's a very substantial reduction. Now, there are issues with workability and with the way that the material behaves, but these can be addressed using different additives. And we are starting to see LC3 being used commercially. I think initially in Colombia, I think Argos started producing LC3 in a plant, an existing plant where they started producing the calcined clay in one of the older cement kilns. And then I suppose, yes, the end of last year, Simpor commissioned a plant in Ivory Coast, which was specifically designed to produce LC3 cement. So Ivory Coast in West Africa has no local limestone to speak of, so that the clinker is imported and is therefore very expensive. So the economics under those circumstances look very attractive. And that's, as I say, now been in operation for nearly a year.
In these technological developments, I wonder where the UK stands. I mean, in all this evolution of the cement industry, we every day hear about the role of cement in net zero carbon building. Where do you feel that the UK stands in all these technological developments?
Well, I think the technologies are adopted around the globe, depending primarily on the local economic. So there are areas in which the UK is probably ahead in terms of adoption of technologies. There are two companies, Carbonate Systems and OCO Technologies, who've been operating now for about 10 years, who have a process that absorbs CO2 and uses the CO2 to cement together effectively pollutants. So initially that was used for biomass to energy plants, but more recently, the technology has been applied by Carbonate Systems in some of VCAT's plants to take the clinker bypass dust and agglomerate that and produce aggregates. So these aggregates effectively have a negative CO2 footprint. To give another example of this, there's a company in San Francisco called Blue Planet, which is also producing synthetic aggregates. So synthetic aggregates, basically calcium carbonate, which anyway most aggregates are, and the synthetic aggregate is taking the CO2 from the air effectively, either from a point source or in principle it could also be from some sort of direct air capture. The plant that Blue Planet have is taking it from a natural gas power generation plant, but the CO2 could come from anywhere. So what you're doing is you're storing CO2 in the aggregate, and calcium carbonate, is in a pure form is more than 40% CO2. So you've got basically calcium oxide and calcium carbonate. So that gives a potential to create an aggregate that has a negative carbon footprint, therefore the potential to have negative carbon footprint concrete. So despite the fact that you still have a carbon footprint coming from the cement, if you look at the quantities involved, then in principle you can get to a point where you have a lot more CO2 being absorbed than emitted.
Ian, my last question, what do you feel that is needed to see many more carbon negative buildings across the globe? And if you believe that the UK's net zero target is reachable, and what kind of policies are needed in order for the UK to reach its climate goals?
Yeah, so I think the policies are tremendously important because it's critical to give people the right incentives. So if we're just going to leave incentives, with the market, then I think progress will be very slow. On the one hand, we see governments around the world, not just in fact, less so in the UK, but governments around the world subsidize fossil fuels in all kinds of different ways. And on the other hand, as I say, if you leave it with the market, then the incentives are limited. So we already have a carbon pricing system in the UK where the carbon price now is pretty significant. And I think that that's a very good start in terms of adjusting the economics so that it will favor lower carbon solution. But the other thing that I'd like to see the UK government doing is thinking about public procurement policies that favor low carbon footprint products. So I know that Network Rail in the UK has been doing some work and looking at the potential for having a zero carbon footprint concrete. And I think if there was some expectation that that would be a requirement in the future, then that would encourage companies to look more seriously at how they might achieve that. And some of the technologies that are now available give us an opportunity to achieve that. So I can see that this is likely to accelerate quite quickly when the market for the zero carbon concrete is established.
As a conclusion, Ian, do you feel that the future of zero carbon cement is bright?
The only way we can get cement to zero carbon, as we understand at the moment, is through carbon capture. And then it's a question of what do we do with the CO2 that we capture? And so I think if we take cement and concrete together, then there's opportunity in the concrete and in the aggregate production to use that captured CO2. So if we look at the product that contractors use, or the building material that's used by customers, then that's concrete rather than cement. And I think if we look at zero carbon concrete, then I'm very optimistic that we can get there.
Ian, thank you very much for this discussion. It was really insightful. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.